Section 1. The Surface. What everyone knows and what they get wrong. There is a show that began as a crude, deliberately offensive parody of a beloved 80s film. A show that almost never happened, that was nearly canceled before it started, that was built on a foundation of two creators who could barely stand to be in the same room as each other for stretches of its own production. And somehow, out of all of that chaos, contradiction, and behind-the-scenes turbulence, it became one of the most philosophically rich, narratively dense, and genuinely beloved pieces of animated television ever made. We are talking about Rick and Morty, and you are about to spend the next 2 hours going deeper into it than you probably expected to go tonight. The iceberg is a useful way to think about this show, because Rick and Morty operates on layers. At the very top, the part sitting above the waterline where everyone can see it, is the premise that most people know. A genius scientist named Rick Sanchez and his nervous teenage grandson Morty go on wild interdimensional adventures. There are aliens. There are portal guns. There are absurd inventions and creatures with names that sound like they were invented by a child who had just eaten too much sugar. The show is funny, it is irreverent, it bites, and for a lot of people that is the whole thing. They watched it at a party once, they thought the pickle thing was hilarious, and they moved on. But for the people who kept watching, something strange happened. The show started revealing itself to be something considerably more complicated. Underneath the fart jokes and the burping and the deliberately juvenile humor, there was a genuine architecture of lore. There were carefully planted seeds that took years to bloom into answers. There were character studies so precise and so unflinching that they stopped being funny and started being genuinely painful. And there was a philosophy threading through every episode, sometimes wearing the costume of comedy, and sometimes dropping the costume entirely and just staring at you. That is what this video is going to explore. All of it. The parts everyone knows, the parts that only the dedicated fans caught, and the parts that go so deep most people do not even realize the show went there. We are going to work our way down through the layers until we hit the bottom, where the really strange things live. But let us start at the top, because even the surface of this show has things in it that most casual viewers missed. Rick and Morty premiered on Adult Swim on the 2nd of December 2013. It was created by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon, two people who had met years earlier at Channel 101, a monthly short film festival in Los Angeles that Harmon had co-founded. Channel 101 worked on a simple principle. You submit a short film in a pilot format. A live audience watches it. They decide if it continues. If they liked it, it became a series. If they did not, it was gone. Roiland had been submitting content to Channel 101 since around 2004. His stuff was raw, deliberately offensive, built on shock value in a way that confused some people and delighted others. But Harmon, who had a nose for a certain kind of talent, even when it was buried under layers of intentional grossness, saw something in Roiland's work. The two of them started collaborating. They found that their sensibilities, despite being very different on the surface, actually complemented each other in a useful way. Harmon was disciplined. He had a background in structured storytelling, in the kind of narrative craft that turns a funny idea into a satisfying story. Roiland was chaotic. He was impulsive. He created things out of a kind of raw, creative instinct that did not always know where it was going, but often ended up somewhere interesting. The show they eventually made together reflected both of them in ways that only became clear over time. But before Rick and Morty existed as Rick and Morty, it existed as something considerably more offensive. In 2006, Roiland made a short film for Channel 101 called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty. If you have seen it, you know exactly what it is. If you have not, the short answer is that it was a deliberately crude parody of Back to the Future, featuring a Doc Brown stand-in coercing a Marty McFly stand-in into doing deeply inappropriate things, all rendered in intentionally bad animation with voices that sounded like Justin Roiland doing fake versions of Christopher Lloyd and Michael J. Fox. The whole thing existed primarily to be offensive. It was a provocation. It was the kind of thing you make when you want to see what you can get away with. It worked at Channel 101 in its own chaotic way, but it also attracted the attention of Universal's lawyers, who sent Roiland a cease and desist letter about the similarity to their intellectual property, which was probably for the best, in retrospect, because being legally barred from continuing Doc and Marty meant that Roiland had to do something different with the concept. He had to sand down the edges, change the names, and reimagine what the relationship between a reckless older figure and his nervous younger companion could look like if it had to function as an actual story rather than just a shock delivery system. What he eventually landed on, with Harmon's help, was Rick and Morty. And while the obvious joke is that Morty spelled backwards is Marty, and that Rick is clearly inspired by Doc Brown right down to the white hair and the lab coat and the taste for dangerous science, the show very quickly became something that Back to the Future was never trying to be. It became a story about grief, about abandonment, about what it feels like to be the smartest person in every room and also somehow the loneliest, and about a kid being slowly shaped by experiences that no kid was ever meant to have. The first episode aired to about 2.5 million viewers. By the time the third season had begun airing in 2017, that audience had exploded into something significantly larger and significantly more passionate. The show had become a cultural phenomenon, which is a phrase that gets overused, but in this case it was genuinely accurate. Rick and Morty merchandise was everywhere. The fandom was enormous and loud and occasionally alarming, and something very strange had happened along the way. A lot of people had decided that Rick Sanchez was aspirational, that Rick's nihilism, his contempt for ordinary life, his refusal to engage with social conventions, his insistence that intelligence separated him from the masses, was something to admire and emulate. People were wearing Rick t-shirts and quoting his most cynical lines as though they were wisdom. This reached a kind of peak absurdity in 2017, when McDonald's brought back their Szechuan dipping sauce as a limited promotion tied to the show, and actual riots broke out at locations that ran out. People screaming at fast food workers, people weeping in parking lots, people filming themselves having genuine meltdowns about chicken nugget sauce. And here is the thing. The Szechuan sauce was a reference from the Season 3 premiere, in which Rick claims his entire motivation, his whole series arc, is to get that sauce back. And he delivers this revelation with such bombastic intensity that it sounds, for a moment, like a meaningful character beat. But then he punctuates it by screaming the name of the sauce at the sky like a madman. It was a joke, a very deliberate joke. The show was pointing at itself and saying, look at how we give things meaning. Look at how easily we manufacture importance out of nothing. And a significant portion of the audience watched that scene and went to their nearest McDonald's. Dan Harmon was not subtle about being disturbed by this. He talked publicly about the anxiety of watching a show that was, at its core, a critique of a certain kind of intellectual arrogance become a lifestyle accessory for people who were performing that exact arrogance without understanding what was being said about it. That tension, the show meaning one thing and being received as another, is one of the most interesting things about Rick and Morty, and it runs underneath everything we are going to talk about in this video. Now, before we go any deeper, let me ask you something. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love seeing the range of places and hours this stuff reaches people. And if you have not yet hit subscribe, this is a good moment to do it. There is a lot more show down below, and we are going to need all the oxygen we can get. Section 2. The origin story nobody tells, right? Most people know the basic facts of how Rick and Morty came to exist. Justin Roiland made a crude parody short. He met Dan Harmon at Channel 101. They pitched a show together to Adult Swim. The show got greenlit, Season 1 happened. But the actual path from that crude 2006 short to the first episode of the actual series is considerably messier and more interesting than the clean version suggests. And the details of that path explain a lot about why the show is the way it is. When Roiland began developing what would become Rick and Morty alongside Harmon, one of the first things that had to happen was a fundamental rethinking of who these characters were. The Doc and Marty dynamic was built almost entirely on the older character abusing the younger one in increasingly explicit ways. It was shock comedy. It had no interior life to speak of. To make a show that could sustain 20-something minute episodes with actual narrative structure, the relationship had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The characters needed to want things. They needed to be afraid of things. They needed, in the language of storytelling, to have something at stake. What Harmon brought to this process was his understanding of story structure. Harmon is famously devoted to the story circle, a narrative framework derived from Joseph Campbell's hero's journey that he had been using since his Community days. The circle maps out 8 stages that a functional story needs to move through. And while Rick and Morty episodes often appear to be deliberately anti-structural, deliberately dismissive of conventional narrative expectations, The best episodes are actually using that structure very precisely. They are just hiding it under chaos the way a magician hides the mechanism of a trick. The initial pitch to Adult Swim was, by all accounts, fairly rough. Roiland and Harmon were given 11 minutes for a pilot, not the full 22, which meant that the first episode of Rick and Morty was actually a compressed, almost hyperactive version of what the show would eventually settle into. Rick's voice in that pilot is different from what it would become. The pacing is different. The relationship between Rick and Morty feels slightly less defined, slightly less nuanced than it would develop into over the first season. But something about it worked. Adult Swim greenlit a full season of 11 episodes, and the writer's room that formed around those 11 episodes was a very specific kind of place. In the early days, the room was populated largely by Roiland's friends and collaborators from Channel 101, people with an improvisational, freewheeling approach to writing comedy. The process was loose. Ideas were pitched. Scenes were built. The show had a lot of energy and not always a lot of discipline. Then, ahead of Season 2, Harmon began bringing in writers from his community days. People with more traditional television writing backgrounds. People who had been through network writers' rooms and knew how to break a story in a conventional sense. This created an immediate tension with the people already in the room, who had developed a comfort with a more unstructured process. And it created a deeper tension with Roiland himself, who began to feel, according to multiple accounts, that the thing that was his was being systematically reorganized into something he no longer recognized. There is an account from Adult Swim's boss at the time, Mike Lazo, that paints a vivid picture of what was actually happening in that office. Harmon would be in the writer's room, doing the grinding work of breaking stories. Roiland would be somewhere else entirely, driving a radio-controlled car around the studio. He was present in the building, but not present in the work. And when scripts eventually arrived that Roiland had genuinely engaged with, they were, according to Lazo, masterpieces. The problem was getting there. By Season 3, the situation had deteriorated to the point where Roiland was barely showing up at all. When he did come in, he would avoid the writer's room. People would know he was in the building because they could hear his dogs or catch a glimpse of that remote-controlled car moving down a hallway. He was recording his voice work from home, doing takes with no direction because he was not in the studio where direction could be given. A professional mediator was brought in to try to repair the relationship between the two creators. The mediator helped them remain civil enough to secure a massive new order from Adult Swim, a deal for 70 new episodes that was announced in 2018, and that represented an enormous financial and creative commitment to the show's future. But the relationship never actually healed. Roiland and Harmon were not on speaking terms for multiple seasons of a show they had co-created together. What this means for the show's history is interesting to sit with. The thing that most fans experience as a unified creative vision, this consistent tone and sensibility that feels unmistakably Rick and Morty, was actually produced under conditions of significant internal conflict. The parts of the show that feel the most improvisational, the most alive with a kind of crackling unpredictability, those are largely Roiland's energy. The parts that feel the most carefully structured, the most thematically coherent, the most deliberately built toward an emotional conclusion, those are largely Harmon's contribution. The show worked, in a very real sense, because these two incompatible energies were forced to coexist within the same 22 minutes. And when that coexistence fell apart, the show had to find a different way to be itself. In January 2023, Adult Swim severed their relationship with Justin Roiland entirely, following a domestic violence charge. The voice of Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith, the voice that had defined those characters for every second of their existence on screen, was gone. The show was not going to stop. There were 70 episodes contracted. But the most fundamental element of the show's identity, the sound of it, had to be rebuilt from scratch. Ian Cardoni took over as the voice of Rick. Harry Belden became the new voice of Morty. Season 7 arrived in 2023, and something remarkable happened. Or rather, something remarkable failed to happen in the way that the Doom predictors expected. The show did not collapse. Cardoni and Belden captured enough of the spirit of the original performances that most viewers adjusted. The new voices were not identical, but they were close enough, and they were consistent, and they were actually in the recording studio taking direction, which created a different energy in the performances. Season 7 received strong reviews. Season 8 continued. The show kept moving. What this episode of the show's history reveals is something that the show itself, in a very meta way, has always been arguing. The thing that makes Rick Sanchez who he is not the specific acoustic properties of Justin Roiland's vocal cords. It is the character, the interior life, the grief and the arrogance and the love that he refuses to name. Rick Sanchez survived his original voice actor in a way that speaks to how well constructed the character actually is at a fundamental level. There is another piece of the origin story that almost never gets told, which is the role that the show's music played from the very beginning. Ryan Elder composed the show's iconic theme and score, and the choice to open the show with that particular synthesizer melody, reminiscent of electronica from the late 80s and early 90s, was a very deliberate tonal signal. It said that this show was going to be nostalgic and cool and a little melancholy all at the same time. The music in Rick and Morty does a tremendous amount of emotional work. There are episodes where the emotional weight of a scene lands entirely because Elder's score shifts under the visuals in a way that tells you how to feel before the dialogue has a chance to. The For the Damaged coda by Blonde Redhead, used for Evil Morty's first reveal, became one of the most discussed musical moments in the show's history because of how perfectly it recontextualized everything that had just happened. The show was built by imperfect people under imperfect conditions, and it was somehow, against a lot of odds, magnificent anyway. That is worth keeping in mind as we go deeper, because some of the most interesting things about Rick and Morty are the places where you can feel the conflict in the seams. Section 3. Who Rick Sanchez really is, the full backstory. Most shows introduce you to their main character and then spend the rest of the series slowly revealing who that character actually is underneath. Rick and Morty does something more unusual. It introduces you to a character who is already impossibly complicated, already carrying the weight of a history you do not yet understand, and then spends years dropping fragments of that history in places where you might not notice them unless you were looking very carefully. Rick Sanchez, designation C-137, is the version of Rick that the show follows. He is the one who lives in the Smith house. He is the one who drinks in the garage. He is the one who takes Morty on adventures and treats the multiverse as his personal laboratory and refuses to acknowledge that he loves the people closest to him even when the evidence that he does is overwhelming. But the question of who Rick was before any of this is one that the show took years to answer, and the answer it eventually gave is darker than most fans expected, even from a show that had not exactly been shy about darkness. The backstory that gets presented, first in fragments and later in a more complete form, is this. Rick C-137 was once a different person. He had a wife named Diane, he had a daughter named Beth. He was a scientist, yes, a brilliant one, but he was also present. He was there. He was a father and a husband who had chosen his family over the kind of God-mode existence his intelligence would have allowed him to pursue. And then another Rick found him. This other Rick, who the fandom eventually came to call Rick Prime, and who the show itself later named as such, was a version of Rick who had made the opposite choice. He had pursued the science. He had abandoned his family in pursuit of the kind of unlimited freedom that his intelligence could buy him. And when he came to C-137 with portal gun technology and an invitation to join him in that life, C-137 refused. Rick Prime's response to being refused was to drop a bomb on C-137's home that killed both Diane and the young Beth. Everything that Rick C-137 is, from the drinking to the arrogance to the nihilism to the desperate, fragile attachment to Morty that he refuses to acknowledge even to himself, comes from that moment. From a man who had something real and watched it be destroyed by a version of himself who had decided that nothing real was worth keeping, the search for Rick Prime became C-137's purpose, his reason for building the portal gun, his reason for engaging with the citadel of Ricks even though he was contemptuous of it, his reason for doing essentially anything that required power and reach and resources that he would not have had if he had stayed in one dimension, drinking in one garage, mourning in private. When the show first introduced a version of Rick's origin story in the Season 3 premiere, it presented it as potentially fabricated. Rick had been captured by the Galactic Federation and placed in a memory prison, and he used the opportunity to feed the Federation a false origin story while secretly escaping. So for a long time, fans were not sure how much of what they had seen was true. Was Diane real? Was any of it real? Subsequent seasons confirmed it. Diane was real. The bombing was real. Rick Prime was real. The grief that runs beneath all of Rick's posturing was real. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the show then revealed that Rick C-137 was complicit, or at least instrumental, in something that made his own suffering seem like just one thread in an enormously larger fabric of ethical horror. The Central Finite Curve. Before we get to what it is, let us sit with the idea that Rick C-137, the Rick who was victimized, the Rick who lost everything to the cruelty of another version of himself, apparently then went on to participate in the construction of a system that walled off an entire section of infinite reality to ensure that in every dimension contained within that wall, Rick was the smartest person in the universe. Every dimension in the curve was a dimension where Rick, by definition, won, where the laws of reality had been arranged to guarantee Rick's supremacy. Evil Morty, in his final confrontation before escaping, calls the Central Finite Curve an infinite crib built around an infinite baby. It is one of the most precise insults ever delivered in animated television, and it lands because it is true. For all of Rick's contempt for vanity and ego, for all of his posturing about being beyond the petty concerns of lesser beings, the most concrete thing he apparently ever built was a monument to his own need to be the most important person in every room. The show leaves some ambiguity about the exact reasons. There is a theory, supported by the evidence of who C-137 actually is, that the curve was built as a tool, that if you are hunting a specific Rick across infinite dimensions, the most efficient thing you can do is narrow the search space to only those dimensions where a Rick exists at all. The curve as a search parameter rather than a vanity project. This reading makes C-137 more sympathetic. It also makes him more tragic, because it suggests that the single-minded pursuit of revenge so consumed him that he was willing to construct something that would trap every version of Morty in a reality designed around Rick's. And that is the thing that evil Morty cannot forgive. Not just that Rick's rule the curve, but that Morty's are the collateral damage. Every Morty in every dimension inside that wall is living in a reality that was built to serve someone else. They are background characters in a story that was written about their grandfathers. Evil Morty's escape is not just a personal act of liberation. It is, on some level, a repudiation of everything that C-137 built. The show does something very clever with all of this, which is that it never tells you definitively how to feel about Rick. You have access to his grief. You understand the shape of his loss, and you can also see very clearly the way that grief calcified into something that has hurt enormous numbers of people and beings across infinite dimensions. He is not a villain. He is also not a hero. He is a person who had something terrible happen to him and responded by becoming enormous in ways that were not always good. That is not a particularly comfortable thing to sit with, and the show seems to know that. One more piece of the backstory that does not get discussed enough. When Rick finally catches Rick Prime, it happens in Season 7 in an episode called Unmortrican. And the confrontation, which fans had been anticipating for years, is not a triumphant moment. It is messy and violent, and when it is over, Rick is not healed. He does not feel better. He has spent however many decades of subjective time organizing his entire existence around the moment of revenge. And the moment arrives and passes, and he is still the same broken person he was before it. The grief did not go with Rick Prime. The grief was always his. Rick Prime was just the story he was telling himself about why he could not put it down. That is a remarkably honest thing for a show that began as a parody of Back to the Future to eventually say about its main character. Section 4. The Citadel, the Ricks, and the most disturbing society ever animated. The Citadel of Ricks is, on paper, one of the most absurd concepts the show ever introduced. Thousands of versions of the same person, from thousands of different dimensions, coming together to build a shared society. A city populated by infinite copies of one man, governed by councils and elections and social hierarchies, and all the apparatus of civilization, except filtered through the specific arrogance of people who all believe, at their core, that they are the smartest and most exceptional being in existence. On paper, it is absurd. In practice, it is one of the sharpest pieces of social satire the show ever produced. The episode that really lets the Citadel breathe, Season 3's The Ricklantis Mix-Up, is structured as a series of interconnected vignettes that show you what life is actually like inside this place. And what you find is not the utopia that a city of geniuses should theoretically produce. What you find is a deeply stratified, deeply corrupt, deeply unequal society that has replicated basically every structural failure of actual human civilizations, just with more portals. There are rich Ricks and poor Ricks. There are Ricks who live in luxury and Ricks who work in factories. There are Ricks who run Simple Ricks, a wafer company that has bottled the neural experience of a particular Rick having a genuine moment of peace and contentment, and sold it as a product. That is worth sitting with for a moment. In the Citadel, there exists a Rick who chose his family over his ambitions and who is described as having been the happiest in that moment. And the Citadel turned that happiness into a commodity. They bottled a Rick's most human experience and sold it to other Ricks as something to consume, because the other Ricks are so estranged from that kind of feeling that they can only access it as a product. The Mortys who live at the Citadel are not citizens. They attend a school called Morty School where they are trained to be effective sidekicks. The curriculum is not about their development as individuals. It is about their utility to the Ricks who will be assigned to them. The teachers, themselves Ricks, regard the Mortys with a mixture of contempt and indifference that mirrors the worst of how actual educational institutions have historically treated people. They do not consider worth investing in. There is a Cop Rick and Cop Morty vignette in the episode that functions as a direct parody of police procedurals, specifically corrupt ones. The Cop Rick is the kind of jaded, by-the-book, look-the-other-way officer who has made peace with a broken system because the broken system serves him just enough. The Cop Morty is newer, more idealistic, more disturbed by what he is seeing, and the resolution of their storyline is not optimistic. All of this is layered beneath the campaign of a Morty who is running for president of the Citadel. A candidate who is telling the Mortys what they need to hear. Who is connecting with an electorate that has been disenfranchised and ignored and treated as lesser for as long as the Citadel has existed. And who is, as the episode reveals in its final moments, Evil Morty. The reveal of Evil Morty as president arrives with that blonde redhead song. The camera slowly pulling back to reveal the eye patch. The dawning horror of understanding that the entire Ricklantis episode, all of those interwoven stories, all of that careful world building, was really about the moment that one Morty decided he had had enough and took over. It is an extraordinary piece of television, and it is worth being explicit about what the show is saying through the Citadel. It is saying that intelligence without empathy produces the same power structures as ignorance without empathy. It is saying that people who believe themselves exceptional tend to build systems that protect their exceptionalism at the expense of everyone else. It is saying that the mythology of meritocracy, the idea that the smartest rise and deserve to rise, is a story that the people at the top tell to justify a hierarchy they have engineered. The Ricks did not rise to the top of the Citadel because they were better. They built the Citadel in a way that guaranteed they would be at the top, and then they called that arrangement natural and inevitable. The Ricks being undone by their own arrogance, being unable to take a Morty seriously as a political threat because they were congenitally incapable of imagining a Morty as a genuine agent of change, is not accidental. It is the point. The Central Finite Curve, as Evil Morty eventually explains it, is the physical manifestation of the same hubris. It is a cage that the smartest beings in the multiverse built around themselves and called a kingdom. Evil Morty's escape from the curve is visually presented as one of the most striking sequences in the entire show's run. The machinery tearing apart, the wall between the curve and the rest of infinite reality beginning to dissolve. Morty and his little ship, passing through into a part of the multiverse where Rick is not the dominant force, where the rules are genuinely different, where the fixed hierarchy that the Ricks built does not apply. He does not look back. He has spent so much of his existence organizing every action toward this single moment that when it arrives, there is nothing sentimental about it. He just leaves. What happens to him after that, the show has been exploring in subsequent seasons. The truth is that leaving the curve opens up questions that the show itself has not fully answered yet. What does a Morty do when Ricks are not the smartest people in the room? What does ambition look like when the system it was organized against no longer exists? Those are interesting questions to sit with while the show continues to develop. There is one more thing about the Citadel worth mentioning, which is the dimension numbering system. The show uses alphanumeric codes for dimensions. Rick C-137 is our Rick. The dimension he originally came from, the one where Diane and Beth were killed, is what gets called the prime dimension or Rick Prime's dimension. The dimension that became home to Rick and Morty after the events of Rick Potion number 9, when Rick accidentally Cronenberged their original world and the two of them jumped to a replacement dimension where their counterparts had just died, is dimension C-131. The current Beth and Summer in the show are from C-131. The original Jerry is still there. This is something the show planted early and then built into one of the most genuinely complicated aspects of its ongoing continuity. Section 5. Morty's Mind Blowers and the Horror of Forgotten Damage. There is a room under the Smith house that most people would rather not think too hard about. It is Rick's vault. Not for weapons or for technology, though Rick has plenty of both. This vault contains something considerably more unsettling. It contains memories. Specifically, it contains memories that Morty has asked Rick to remove from his mind because they were too much to carry. The episode Morty's Mind Blowers in Season 3 uses the structure of one of the show's anthology formats to revisit this room. Rick and Morty go in. They start playing back the memories. And what they find is a record of experiences so genuinely awful that a 14-year-old kid decided he would rather lose pieces of himself than continue holding them. Morty accidentally drives an innocent man to suicide by framing him as something terrible. He watches people die because of decisions he made. He experiences a moment in which his own mother, faced with the choice between him and his sister, does not even hesitate before choosing Summer. He sees the scope of the damage his adventures have caused, damage that he had been protected from by the erasure of the memories that documented it. And then there are the memories in the vault that Morty did not ask to have removed. Rick took those ones himself, not to protect Morty, to protect Rick. These are memories in which Rick looked foolish, in which Rick made mistakes that he did not want Morty to have access to. Rick has been quietly curating Morty's mind to shape the version of Rick that Morty remembers. That is not incidental. That is a profound violation of Morty's autonomy, carried out with the casual ease of someone who has been doing it for so long that it no longer registers as unusual. The episode has been discussed primarily as a dark comedy anthology in the spirit of the interdimensional cable episodes. But it is actually one of the most disturbing explorations of the Rick and Morty dynamic that the show ever produced. What it reveals is that the running total of damage being done to Morty is larger and more severe than any single episode has shown. Because the worst experiences have been systematically hidden from him, he does not remember the full weight of what his life has been. He cannot. Rick has made sure of that. The writers revealed that they generated roughly 100 different mind-blower concepts for this episode, and then had to vote them down to the ones that made the final cut. Writer Dan Guterman shared some of the rejected ideas on social media after the episode aired. They included a memory Morty has of being an old man and helping his granddaughter with homework, a scenario that implies Rick has been manipulating time in ways that age-shifted Morty without his knowledge. Rick falling in love with a fire truck. These are funny, but the fact that they were rejected in favor of the darker material that made the episode tells you something about what the writers were actually going for. The really uncomfortable implication of the Mind Blowers room is what it suggests about the continuity of identity. If a person is the sum of their experiences, and a significant portion of those experiences have been selectively removed without consent, who is that person? Is Morty actually Morty? Or is Morty a curated version of a person who has experienced things that the current Morty has no access to and no memory of? This is not just a philosophical question. It has practical implications for how we understand Morty's development throughout the show. He appears to be learning and growing through his adventures. But if a meaningful portion of his most formative experiences have been periodically wiped, how genuine is that growth? He may be, in a very real sense, restarting from a modified baseline again and again without knowing it. There is a fan theory that takes this even further, suggesting that Rick's motivation for keeping Morty at 14, rather than allowing him to age normally, is directly connected to the Mind Blowers. A Morty who ages, who accumulates uninterrupted memories, who grows into an adult with the full weight of everything he has experienced, might not be the manageable companion Rick needs. Keeping him young, keeping him periodically wiped, is a way of keeping him in a state where he remains useful and remains attached. The show confirmed in Season 6 that Rick has been doing something to keep the family from aging at a normal rate. The exact mechanism has not been fully explained, but the confirmation that it is happening is there. Section 6. Evil Morty, the timeline of a revolution. Evil Morty is, by the consensus of most people who have thought carefully about the show, the most interesting character Rick and Morty has ever produced. He appears in relatively few episodes. He has limited screen time compared to the main cast. And yet his arc, from the moment of his first silent reveal to the image of his ship passing through the broken wall of the Central Finite Curve, is one of the most sustained and satisfying pieces of storytelling in modern animation. To understand Evil Morty properly, you need to understand what a Morty is supposed to be within the world of the show. Mortys are, as the show explains through the Citadel, biologically useful to Ricks in a very specific way. The neural frequencies of a Morty, the particular pattern of his relatively average brainwaves, cancel out the towering genius frequency of a Rick's mind in a way that makes Rick much harder to detect by parties who might be looking for him. A Morty walking next to a Rick is a form of camouflage? The Morty's simplicity, the show rather bluntly suggests, makes the Rick harder to find. This is presented as the practical justification for the Rick-Morty pairing dynamic across all the dimensions in the Citadel. Ricks bring Mortys on adventures not out of affection, or at least not primarily out of affection, but because a Morty is useful cover. The emotional bond is a side effect, a welcome one in many cases, but structurally secondary to the camouflage function. Evil Morty understood this. He did not just understand it intellectually in the way that any sufficiently thoughtful Morty might. He internalized it and refused to accept it. He decided that the function assigned to him by the structure of his reality was not a fate he was obligated to accept. And then he began, with extraordinary patience and discipline, to do something about it. His first appearance, in the Season 1 episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, is a masterclass in misdirection. The episode is about a series of Rick murders being committed by an evil Rick who has been kidnapping and torturing Mortys. Our Rick and Morty get pulled into the investigation. The Citadel's enforcement arm tracks down the evil Rick. He is captured. The mystery seems solved. And then, in the final moments, the camera drifts to a group of rescued Mortys. One of them presses a button on a remote control. The evil Rick's head sparks and goes still. He was a puppet. He was being operated by a Morty. The Morty removes his eye patch, looks at the camera, and smiles. That is all we get. No speech. No explanation. Just the evidence of a plan so carefully constructed that it was completely invisible until it chose to reveal itself. The eye patch was, it turns out, a mind control device that Evil Morty had built to control his Rick. He had taken the relationship between Rick and Morty, in which the Rick directs and the Morty follows, and quietly inverted it. The Rick was the puppet. The Morty was the puppeteer. He had been playing the part of a sidekick while secretly running the whole operation. The level of foresight required to put that plan together is staggering. Evil Morty had to identify a Rick he could control. He had to build the control device without that Rick noticing. He had to then use that Rick to kidnap other Mortys and construct the elaborate scenario that would draw the Citadel's attention while concealing his own role in it. And he had to do all of this while performing, at all times, the role of a perfectly ordinary, perhaps slightly traumatized, Morty who would not be worth a second look. His second major appearance, in the Citadel election episode, is where his real plan reveals itself. He campaigns for president. He connects with the Morty population by speaking plainly about the inequality they face. He is not performing solidarity. He understands their situation because he has lived it. He has been exactly where they are, and he wins. He wins an election that the Ricks running the Citadel were so certain could not produce a Morty winner that they barely bothered to take his candidacy seriously. Once in power, he uses the resources of the Citadel for the thing he actually came for. He uses its technology, its infrastructure, its accumulated knowledge, to find a way to break the Central Finite Curve and get out. And in the Season 5 finale, he does exactly that. The thing that makes Evil Morty's arc genuinely tragic rather than purely triumphant is what it costs. He tears the Citadel apart. Ricks and Mortys die. The society that existed there, broken and unequal as it was, is destroyed. Evil Morty is explicitly not a hero. The show does not try to frame him as one. He is someone who was put in a cage, figured out how the cage was built, and broke it open on the way out regardless of who was in the way. And then he leaves, alone. Into a multiverse where Rick is not the smartest being in every room. Into dimensions where none of the rules that governed his entire existence apply. What does he find there? The show has been gradually revealing this, and the answer is not simple. Section 7. The real science, and where it breaks down beautifully. One of the more surprising things about Rick and Morty is how often the science is actually real. Not the portal gun, Not the Meeseeks box, not most of the gadgets, but the conceptual frameworks that the show uses to build its multiverse, the ideas that make the fiction feel genuinely weighty rather than just made up on the spot, those often have legitimate scientific counterparts. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is the closest real-world analog to the Rick and Morty multiverse, was first formally proposed by physicist Hugh Everett in 1957. The idea, simplified considerably, is this. At the quantum level, particles do not have definite states until they are observed. Before observation, they exist in a superposition of all possible states simultaneously. The Copenhagen interpretation, which is the most widely taught version of quantum theory, says that the act of observation causes the wave function to collapse into a single definite state. The particle picks one possibility and that becomes real. The many worlds interpretation takes a different approach. It says the wave function never actually collapses. Instead, when an observation happens, the universe splits. Every possible outcome occurs, just in different branches of reality. The universe you experience is the one where this particular outcome happened. But there are other universes, branching off at every quantum event, where every other outcome happened instead. The implications of this are enormous and, for people who think about them too long, somewhat destabilizing. It means that there is a universe where you made every decision differently, where you are a completely different person, where you do not exist at all, where every possible version of history is playing out simultaneously in branches that cannot interact with each other. This is, broadly speaking, the structure that Rick and Morty is using for its multiverse. The show gets some of the details wrong, and scientists who have commented on it are generally forgiving about this because the show is not trying to be a textbook. But the underlying logic is drawn from real physics. Brian Greene, professor of physics and mathematics at Columbia University, has written extensively about multiverse theory and has spoken about the scientific plausibility of the concept. Max Tegmark at MIT has gone further, proposing up to 4 distinct types of multiverse. The point is that the concept the show is playing with has genuine intellectual credibility among physicists, even if there is no consensus and significant skepticism within the field. The episode A Wrinkle in Time from Season 2 is perhaps the most physics-accurate episode of the series. It depicts what happens when time is unfrozen after Rick held it still for 6 months at the end of Season 1. The instability of the restored timeline, caused by Morty and Summer's continuous state of minor disagreement, begins splitting reality into parallel versions. The screen literally divides, showing multiple slightly different versions of the same scene simultaneously. The show is, in its way, visualizing quantum superposition, the state of being in multiple possibilities at once before an observation forces a resolution. The cockroach mind control episode from Season 1, Lawnmower Dog, also has some genuine science behind it. The idea of hijacking insect neural systems via chemical or electrical means is not purely fictional. Real laboratory setups using electrical stimulation of insect brains exist. The specifics of the show are cartoon physics rather than actual science, but the underlying concept of using chemical manipulation to control insect behavior is grounded in real neuroscience. The simulation hypothesis, used most directly in the Season 3 episode Morty's Mind Blowers, with the tinyverse concept, and explored in various other forms across the series, is a genuine philosophical and scientific debate. Nick Bostrom's 2003 paper arguing that we are probably living in a computer simulation has been taken seriously enough that Elon Musk, among others, has publicly discussed the probability. The show uses this idea as a setup for jokes, which is probably the most reasonable response to it. Where the show's science decisively breaks down, and this is where it gets philosophically interesting rather than just scientifically interesting, is in the question of whether travel between these parallel realities is possible. The many worlds interpretation, if accurate, describes branches of reality that are by definition causally disconnected from each other. Once a quantum event produces a branch, the branches cannot interact. The portal gun violating this is not a science error in the way that getting the speed of light wrong would be a science error. It is a fundamental requirement of the story. The portal gun is the premise. Without the portal gun, there is no show. But it is worth knowing that what the portal gun does is, even in a universe where the many worlds interpretation is completely accurate, not something physics currently has a framework for. The show is aware of this tension and occasionally nods at it, Rick's science is presented as being so far beyond the current state of human understanding that the normal rules cannot be used to evaluate it. He is not violating physics. He is operating beyond the edge of what physics has mapped. That is a clever and somewhat self-aware way to bracket the problem. One more genuine science thread worth pulling? The Cronenberg episode, Rick Potion number 9 from Season 1, in which Rick's failed love potion causes a pandemic that transforms the human population of Earth into grotesque hybrid creatures, is drawing loosely on real ideas about viral vectors and genetic modification. The mechanics are cartoon physics, obviously. But the concept of a pathogen being engineered to spread a specific biological change through a population, and the idea of that change cascading through immune systems in ways that could not be predicted or controlled, is not entirely outside the range of concerns that real scientists have expressed about certain categories of biotechnology. The show's won't-shoe's willingness to take real science and stretch it into places where the science cannot follow, while being honest enough about the stretching that it does not pretend to be a documentary, is one of its more charming qualities. It wants to play with the ideas. It is not trying to teach you physics, but it is trying to make the ideas feel like they matter, and the best episodes succeed at this in a way that makes you want to read more after the episode ends. Section 8. The philosophy, what the show is actually arguing. Rick and Morty has been called a nihilist show by a significant number of people who are not sure what nihilism actually means. It has been called a show that argues nothing matters. It has been called a show that glorifies Rick's worldview. And all of these readings are, to put it gently, missing something important. Rick Sanchez is a nihilist in the sense that he has a genuine, coherent belief that the universe is indifferent to individual experience and that conventional sources of meaning, religious, social, romantic, are constructs rather than discoveries. He believes this. He has articulated versions of it across the run of the show. And his intelligence, his ability to generate sophisticated arguments for almost any position, means that when he makes the case for this view, it is not easy to dismiss. But the show is not endorsing it, the show is examining it. There is a difference, and it is a crucial one. Consider the most famous philosophical moment in the show's run. Morty, in the first season episode 60 Minutes, sits with his sister Summer and says something that has been quoted so many times it has become almost rote. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV. This sounds on paper like a nihilist statement. And it is, in a sense. But the emotional context of the scene is not despair. Morty is not telling Summer that nothing matters as a reason to give up. He is telling her this as a reason to stay. As a reason to be present with the people she has, in the time that exists, because the absence of cosmic meaning does not make immediate human meaning any less real or any less worth having. That is not nihilism. That is closer to what philosophers call optimistic nihilism, or what Albert Camus was reaching toward with absurdism. The universe is indifferent. Life is inherently without fixed meaning, and therefore you are free to make the meaning yourself, in the choices you make and the people you stay beside. The Szechuan sauce moment from the Season 3 premiere is the most discussed illustration of this philosophical argument, and it is the one that most people either get completely right or completely miss. Rick's insistence that his whole motivation is to recover a discontinued McDonald's dipping sauce is not meant to be taken at face value. It is a statement about the nature of desire and purpose. The thing you are chasing does not have to be grand. It does not have to be cosmically significant. It just has to be yours. The hunt for Szechuan sauce is absurd in the way that Camus' Sisyphus is absurd. Sisyphus rolls a boulder up a hill. It rolls back down. He rolls it up again. Forever. And Camus says you should imagine Sisyphus happy, because the act of pushing is the thing, not the destination. Rick hunting for a dipping sauce across dimensions is the show's way of gesturing at this. The meaning is not in the sauce. The meaning is in having something, however arbitrary, that gives direction to the movement. Now, this philosophical framework is also where the show is most consistently misread, and misread in ways that have real-world consequences. If you take Rick's nihilism as something to admire and emulate without understanding what the show says about it, you end up with the version of Rick and Morty fandom that Dan Harmon found disturbing. The version where people were using the show's ideas as justification for contempt of others, for dismissal of emotional engagement, for the performance of a detachment they imagined to be sophisticated. The show's own attitude toward Rick's nihilism is most clearly expressed not through Rick himself, but through the consequences of his worldview. Rick's intelligence and his refusal to invest emotionally in anything is precisely what has destroyed the relationships that matter most to him. His wife is gone. His original daughter is gone. His friendship with Birdperson has been shattered by forces that his nihilism helped set in motion. His relationship with Morty is in a constant state of tension because Rick keeps trying to have the benefits of genuine connection without acknowledging that genuine connection requires vulnerability and investment. The show is not saying Rick is right. The show is saying Rick is brilliant and broken, and that those two things are not as separate as he thinks they are. The strongest counterargument to Rick's worldview, as we noted earlier, is Mr. Poopy Butthole, a character who has experienced genuine suffering, who was shot by someone he trusted, whose life fell apart in ways that were not his fault, and who continues to choose warmth and kindness and genuine engagement with the people around him. He does not do this because he has been protected from the evidence of the universe's indifference. He does it in full knowledge of that indifference. He chooses it anyway. That choice, made in full awareness, is the show's most direct argument that Rick's philosophy is not wisdom, it is armor. And armor is not the same thing as truth. The show has also engaged seriously with the question of free will in a way that most animated series never bother with. If the multiverse contains infinite versions of every possible choice, what does it mean to choose anything? If there is a version of you that made the opposite decision in every situation, is any decision really yours? Rick's ability to see across dimensions, to know that every choice is being made somewhere, gives him a kind of cosmic perspective that should, by the logic of his philosophy, make individual choice meaningless. But the show quietly argues against this too. The episode about Jerry and Morty in the car, the one where Morty sees all the possible futures depending on whether he gives Jerry his keys, is often read as an argument for how limited our choices are. But it can also be read as an argument for the opposite. Yes, many futures lead to the same place, but the path still matters. The person you are in the process of getting there is shaped by the choices you make, even if the destination is the same. Rick can see infinite dimensions, but he still acts. He still chooses. And the choices accumulate into a person, which is to say, into him. Section 9. The hidden layer Easter eggs, background details, and things you blinked and missed. Rick and Morty rewards obsessive viewers in ways that most television does not bother with. The animators and writers seed the show with details that operate on a frequency most casual viewers simply cannot pick up, not because they are not smart enough, but because the details are often so small, so brief, or so dependent on pausing and examining frame by frame that catching them requires genuine effort. Some of these are jokes, some of them are foreshadowing, and some of them are the kind of thing that, once you see them, recontextualizes everything you thought you understood about a particular scene or episode. The parasite egg foreshadowing is one of the most discussed examples. In the episode Morty Night Run, Rick collects some green rocks for their chemical properties. If you watch carefully, you can see bright pink eggs clinging to those rocks. Those eggs are the same type of parasite organism that shows up in the very next episode, Total Recall, where parasitic creatures invade the Smith house by implanting fake memories and disguising themselves as beloved family members. The show told you the parasites were coming one episode before they arrived, in a piece of visual information that was sitting in plain sight but designed to be invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. The Dan Harmon vanity card is another example of something that changed in a way most people never noticed. Each episode of Rick and Morty ends with a brief card for Harmon's production company, Harmonious Claptrap. In early seasons, the card depicted something recognizable from Harmon's life. After his divorce, the image on the card changed to show a lonely, disheveled figure sitting alone surrounded by evidence of alcohol. Harmon put his personal life into the background detail of a production card that most viewers skip past without a second look. It is either deeply sad or darkly funny, possibly both. And it is very Rick and Morty. The community reference in autoerotic assimilation. In that episode, Rick asks Unity, the hive mind he used to be romantically entangled with, to create a television show for him. Unity creates a show featuring alien versions of characters sitting around a table in a study group configuration. The specific configuration is an exact recreation of the community study group, the ensemble cast from Harmon's earlier series. It is a loving self-reference dropped in as background detail that the show then has Rick cancel and recommission multiple times before losing interest in, which is also kind of a commentary on the experience of watching Community get canceled and renewed. In the episode The Ricklantis Mix-Up, if you look carefully at the crowd scenes inside the Citadel of Ricks, you can spot a Doctor Who Rick wearing a long multicolored scarf among the assembled Ricks. It is there for about 2 seconds. It requires pausing, but it is there. The time travel stuff box that appears in Rick's garage in multiple episodes has a specific function in the show's internal logic that gets easily missed. Rick has canonically stated that time travel is for simpletons and that he does not engage with it. The time travel stuff box is presented as something he confiscated or acquired but does not use. Its presence in the background of the garage across multiple episodes is partly a joke about all the science fiction concepts the show is deliberately not using. But in later seasons, when time manipulation starts becoming relevant to the show's ongoing plot, the fact that Rick has had access to time-related technology all along takes on a different resonance. The detail about how time is written in Rick's calculations is one that only people with physics backgrounds are likely to catch on their own. When Rick writes out mathematical notation, time is written using vector notation rather than scalar notation. This is a specific mathematical choice that implies Rick has solved for a directional, multi-dimensional understanding of time rather than the simple linear model that conventional physics uses. It is the kind of detail that an animator or writer had to specifically choose because they could easily have used conventional notation and nobody except a physicist would have known the difference. The fact that they chose the vector notation suggests that someone on the show was thinking carefully about what Rick's mathematics would actually look like. The post-credit scenes deserve their own discussion because the show uses them as a secondary storytelling space in ways that are cleverer than they first appear. Some post-credit scenes are pure jokes, non-sequiturs designed to send you off on a weird note, but others plant seeds that grow into future episodes. The Meeseeks who did not get a task completed in the original Meeseeks episode appearing in a post-credit scene to suggest that there may be a Meeseeks still somewhere in the universe who never fulfilled his purpose is played as a joke, but given everything the show has established about what happens to Meeseeks when they cannot complete their task, it is also genuinely disturbing if you think about it for more than 3 seconds. The alien who appears in a Season 1 crowd scene is believed by some fans to be a very early visual hint about interdimensional culture that the show later expanded on. Whether this is intentional foreshadowing or retroactive connection-making by fans is the kind of question that the show leaves deliberately unresolved because part of the pleasure of Rick and Morty is the constant uncertainty about how much of what you are seeing is planned and how much is improvised. The truth tortoise, which Morty briefly glimpses in the opening of Morty's Mind Blowers, says something when you play the audio backwards. It reportedly says, "I'm a beetle, Paul is dead," in what sounds like an obscured version of Justin Roiland's voice. This is almost certainly a joke rather than actual content, but it is the kind of joke that only exists if you are actively trying to find it, which means the show is specifically catering to the portion of its audience that is analyzing it at this level. Section 10. The darkest episodes. What the show actually did with its freedom. Adult Swim gave Rick and Morty a lot of freedom, more than most animated shows ever get. The content limitations were minimal, the creative constraints were largely self-imposed, and the show used that freedom in some ways that were groundbreaking and some ways that were genuinely uncomfortable. The Meeseeks episode is probably the best example of the show doing something structurally simple in a way that ends up being philosophically complex. The Meeseeks are creatures designed to exist only long enough to complete a task. Rick introduces them to the family as a convenience, a way of outsourcing chores and minor requests. Summer, Beth, and Jerry each summon one. Summer and Beth's Meeseeks complete their tasks relatively quickly and disappear. Jerry's does not, because Jerry's request to remove 2 strokes from his golf game requires a sustained change in Jerry's behavior. Jerry is not capable of the change. The Meeseeks helping him stays alive far longer than it was ever designed to exist. And existence, for a Meeseeks, is pain. The show tells you this directly. The character says it out loud. Being alive is not something Meeseeks are built for. They are built to solve a problem and stop existing. Every second beyond that purpose is agony. The cascade that follows, as desperate Meeseeks summon other Meeseeks to help, as the accumulated weight of too long existence drives them collectively toward violence, is played mostly for comedy, but the philosophical kernel underneath it is remarkably dark. These creatures have a built-in purpose, a thing that gives their existence meaning, and when that purpose is denied them, they fall apart in ways that are recognizably human in their desperation. Rick created them that way. This is the part of the Me-Seeks episode that tends to get overlooked in discussions about it. Rick built these beings. He designed their experience of existence as painful by default. He engineered the compulsion that makes that pain bearable by giving it a direction. And then he handed a box full of them to his family as a party favor. The ethical horror of the Me-Seeks box is not that they go wrong. It is that they were designed by Rick, who was fully aware of what they would experience, and handed out for convenience. The episode Autoerotic Assimilation goes to a place that was genuinely unprecedented for an animated comedy at the time. Rick reconnects with Unity, a hive mind consciousness he used to be in a relationship with. The episode spends most of its runtime being funny about the nature of Rick and Unity's dynamic, about what it means to be in love with something that can be all people at once, about the specific indulgences Rick allows himself when he has access to a willing hive mind. And then Unity leaves. She writes Rick a note explaining that she loves him but that being around him makes her worse. That his influence pushes her toward nihilism and recklessness. That she has to go. Rick goes down to the garage after reading the note. There is a piece of music. The camera watches him from a distance. He begins to set up what appears to be a device of some kind. He leans back. He closes his eyes. The device activates and a small glass tube begins to drift toward his face. Rick is trying to kill himself. The mechanism fails or the timing is off, and he falls unconscious before it can work. The next morning, he is up for breakfast as though nothing happened. The scene receives no commentary. No one in the family knows it happened. The show does not process it. It just shows it to you and moves on. And that restraint, that refusal to underline what it just said, is what makes it so devastating. Rick is, at some level, in agony that he cannot bring himself to acknowledge even in the moment of trying to exit it. The scene is not a cliffhanger. It is not a story beat that the show follows up on in the conventional sense. It is just a window into something that is always there, underneath the burping and the arrogance and the portal gun antics, and the window opens briefly and then closes. That level of honesty about a character's interior life, delivered without fanfare in a moment that most viewers might not even have fully processed as what it was, is not something animation does very often. It is something Rick and Morty did in its first season. The episode in which Morty is assaulted by a crystalline alien and Rick buries the evidence without telling Morty what happened, referenced obliquely in the show and more directly in discussion of what the show decided it could and could not address explicitly, is another example of the show going to a place that mainstream television avoids almost completely. The handling of that storyline is careful, and the aftermath is more about Morty's recovery than the incident itself, but the show's decision to acknowledge that this kind of harm exists in the world, even the cartoon one, was a choice that required courage. Beth's implied history as a deeply troubled child is another thread the show plants, and then leaves partially unresolved in a way that makes it more rather than less unsettling. References are made to things Beth did when she was young. Rick built her toys that were functionally weapons. There are suggestions, never fully confirmed, that Beth may have seriously harmed other children. The show does not dramatize this. It gestures at it through the reactions of other characters and leaves the specific details to implication. But the implication is consistent across multiple references, suggesting that this is not accidental background noise, but a deliberate characterization choice. Beth is a person who had some dark early years that shaped her in ways she does not have full access to, in a household that was missing its father figure and therefore missing whatever stabilizing influence that might have provided. Section 11. The Wubba Lubba Dub. Dub of it all. What Rick never says out loud. Rick Sanchez's catchphrase in the early seasons, the chaotic nonsense syllables he would burst out at random moments, turns out to not be nonsense at all. This is revealed in the Season 1 episode Rick's Business by Birdperson, who speaks the phrase as his native language and translates it for Morty. In Birdperson's language, the phrase means, roughly, "I am in great pain, please help me." Birdperson delivers this information with characteristic Birdperson gravity and then moves on, as though he has said something mildly interesting rather than something that completely recontextualizes everything that has come before it. Rick has been yelling his distress at maximum volume in a language only his oldest friend understands. He has been broadcasting pain in a frequency that reads as performance to everyone who does not know the code. Every time he said it, he was asking for help, and the people around him heard it as a celebration. This is the thematic center of Rick Sanchez in 4 words, and the show puts it in a single line, delivered by a supporting character in an episode that is mostly about a house party. That is how Rick and Morty hides its most important moments. Birdperson himself represents something essential to the show's emotional architecture. He is Rick's oldest friend. He is the person who has known Rick the longest and has chosen to remain loyal despite knowing exactly who Rick is. Birdperson does not maintain this loyalty out of naivety. He has seen Rick at his worst. He was in the war alongside Rick. He knows what Rick does to the people who get close to him. He stays anyway. The relationship between Rick and Birdperson is the show's most straightforward illustration of what genuine love looks like in a universe that is constantly arguing against the possibility of genuine love. Birdperson commits. That is the whole of his characterization. He commits to causes and to people, and he does not revise that commitment when things become difficult. In a show full of characters who run, who deflect, who build elaborate philosophical frameworks for why emotional investment is foolish, Birdperson is the character who simply does not do any of that. His arc through the series, from trusted friend to betrayed wedding victim to the horror of Phoenix Person to whatever comes next in the ongoing story of his recovery, is one of the most emotionally coherent threads in the entire show. The wedding episode, Rick Marie Jack as a climactic payoff, and the episodes preceding it as setup, works as tragedy specifically because we understand by that point what Birdperson's loyalty cost him. He gave it to Tammy completely and without reservation. He had no walls up because walls are antithetical to who he is. And that openness, that willingness to be fully seen, was the thing that made him vulnerable in exactly the way Tammy exploited. The show's willingness to do that to one of its most admirable characters is part of what makes Rick and Morty feel honest in a way that conventional storytelling often does not. The good people do not get protected by their goodness. Birdperson's loyalty is not rewarded with safety. It is used against him in the cruelest way the show could devise. And then Rick, who is not the kind of person who fights for people, spends seasons trying to get his friend back. Because some people, when they are lost, are worth going after. There is a recurring structural element in the show that is worth naming explicitly, which is the way the show uses the post-adventure decompression moment. After the chaos of a given episode, after the explosions and the close calls and the existential confrontations, there is often a quiet moment in the car or on the couch where the emotional reality of what just happened settles. These moments are where the show does its most unguarded work. The conversations in these moments tend to be shorter and more honest than the action-heavy sequences that precede them. They are the show breathing. And they are often where you find the most direct access to what Rick is actually feeling underneath the performance of not feeling anything. The Season 1 finale, where Rick freezes time to help clean up after the party, and the show spends that frozen interval giving the audience a compressed version of a slow, quiet summer during which Rick and his grandkids genuinely connect, is one of the most emotionally precise things the show has ever done. Everything that follows in the series, every adventure, every conflict, every near-death and narrow escape, is in some way an echo of that quiet time. That is the period during which the relationship between Rick and Morty becomes something more than utility on Rick's part. That is when it becomes love, even if Rick would rather bite his own tongue off than say so. Section 12. The deeper implications what the show does to time, memory, and identity. We touched on the frozen time and the mind-wiping earlier, but the show's treatment of identity deserves its own extended examination because it is doing something philosophically sophisticated that tends to get lost in the noise of the plot. The question of whether Rick C-137 is the same Rick who started the show is genuinely complicated. Rick, by the show's own internal logic, has replaced significant portions of his biology with technology. He has been cloned or something like cloned at least once. He has occupied different bodies. He has operated from within simulations so convincing that distinguishing them from reality requires active effort. He has had his memories manipulated, his motivations recontextualized, his history revised by his own accounts given under pressure. In Season 6, the show visits Rick's original dimension and reveals that time there has been stuck in a loop, the same day repeating, the inhabitants unaware. Rick set this up. The reasons are not fully explained. But the implication is that Rick has been treating entire populated dimensions as settings rather than as realities that contain genuine people with genuine lives. The loop is not presented as a malicious act. It is presented as something Rick did without apparently giving it a great deal of moral consideration, which is, itself, a piece of character information. The show returned to this territory more explicitly in Season 6's Solarix, which sends Rick and Morty back to their original respective dimensions. Rick goes back to the dimension where Diane and Beth died. Morty goes back to the dimension where the Cronenberg plague still rages, where the version of himself and Rick died, and were buried in the backyard by the current Rick and Morty, after jumping dimensions at the end of Rick Potion number 9. That backyard grave scene from Season 1 is one of the most discussed moments in the show's history, and for good reason. Rick instructs Morty to dig. They find the bodies, their own bodies, and Rick tells Morty to help him bury them. And then he walks away. And Morty stands there, looking at the grave, processing what it means that he is currently occupying the life of a version of himself who is buried in the ground 3 feet away. The show uses this as a trauma baseline for Morty. This is the thing Rick showed him, the thing Rick made him do, very early in their adventures. And the argument the show is making, subtly but consistently, is that nobody should have to do that. Nobody should have to bury themselves. Nobody should have to move into a dead version of their own house and introduce themselves to a family that lost their version of the people standing in front of them. Morty carries this. The Mind Blowers episode confirms that he also carries hundreds of other things he does not consciously remember. The cumulative weight of his experiences, the ones he knows about, and the ones that have been hidden from him, is a kind of invisible architecture that shapes who he is in ways that he cannot fully account for. The question of who Morty would be without all of this, without the adventures and the trauma and Rick's influence, gets addressed most directly through the evil Morty lens. Evil Morty is, in some readings, Morty taken to his logical extreme. Not by being given more of the same experiences, but by fully processing them without suppression. Evil Morty did not get his memories wiped. He sat with everything that happened to him and he felt it and he decided what to do about it. The result is terrifying. Which raises a question that the show lets hang in the air. Is Morty's continuing warmth and relative optimism a sign of resilience? Or is it a sign that he has been protected from his own full experience by a Rick who needs him to stay useful? The show does not answer this definitively. It holds the tension. And holding that kind of tension, refusing to resolve it in either a comforting or a nihilistic direction, is one of the things that makes Rick and Morty feel so different from most animated television. It is comfortable being uncomfortable in a way that other shows frequently are not. Section 13. What came after the post-Roiland era, and what it tells us? The departure of Justin Roiland from the show he co-created forced Rick and Morty to answer a question it had been implicitly asking about itself for years. Are these characters the product of one specific person's creative vision? Or have they achieved a kind of independent existence, a life of their own in the minds of the writers and the audience, that does not depend on any one person to sustain? The evidence as of Season 7 and Season 8 suggests the latter. The show continued, not just in a going-through-the-motions sense, but in a way that felt genuinely alive. Season 7 in particular was received as a creative resurgence by many viewers and critics who had been concerned that the loss of Roiland's voice would be fatal to the show's identity. Episodes like Unmortrican, which finally delivered on years of setup around Rick Prime, were praised as some of the best the show had ever produced. The writing room, now more stable and more collaborative than it had been during the turbulent Roiland years, found a rhythm that worked. This says something interesting about the nature of creative work that is usually discussed in the context of business realities, but is actually a deeper question about art. We tend to attribute creative work to individuals. We talk about Harmon's show or Roiland's show as though it belongs to one of them. But Rick and Morty was, by the time of Roiland's departure, the product of a very large number of people. Writers, directors, animators, composers, voice actors, sound designers. The machinery of the show was so large and had been running so long that removing any single part of it, even a central part, did not stop the machine. The new voice actors, Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden, have spoken in interviews about the pressure of taking on characters so deeply associated with a specific performer. Their approach was to focus on the character rather than on trying to replicate the original sound exactly. They studied the character's behavior, the emotional logic of Rick and Morty's respective histories, and tried to serve those rather than to imitate. The result is voices that are recognizably the same characters without being identical to the original performances. Whether this is a compromise or an improvement probably depends on how long you watched the original run and how attached you became to those specific sounds. What the post-Roiland era has done most interestingly is to double down on the serialized storytelling that represents Harmon's strongest instinct. The more improvisational, episode of the week energy that was Roiland's contribution has not disappeared, but the show is perhaps leaning more heavily on its ongoing narrative threads than it did when Roiland was more actively involved. Whether this is a creative choice or an inevitable consequence of the show's evolving structure is not entirely clear, but it is a perceptible shift. The show is now operating without the creative tension between its two founders that produced both its best work and its worst logistical nightmares. What replaces that tension is a writing room that has found its own internal dynamic. Time will determine what that dynamic produces over the long term. But the early evidence suggests that Rick and Morty is more durable than even its most passionate defenders expected. Section 14. The family as a system. Jerry, Beth, Summer, and why they hold together. We have spent most of this video focused on Rick and on the larger cosmological architecture of the show. But the Smith family, in its messy, dysfunctional, deeply human entirety, is what the show is actually about in its quieter moments. And the way the family functions as a system tells you things about the show's view of ordinary life that the Portal Gun adventures cannot. Jerry Smith is the character most casual viewers dismiss, and most careful viewers eventually identify as one of the show's most interesting creations. Jerry is insecure in a way that is sometimes painful to watch, occasionally infuriating, and ultimately recognizable in a way that cuts close to something most people would prefer not to look at in themselves. The show is explicit about what Jerry does not have. He is not smart. He is not talented in ways the family values. He is not useful in the way that Rick is useful or in the way that Beth's surgical skill is useful. He is a man who has built a life around a marriage that began as a teenage necessity and has continued through a combination of genuine love, genuine habit, and genuine terror at the alternative. But Jerry has something the show does not give enough credit to, which is persistence. Jerry does not quit. He is mocked, dismissed, humiliated, and consistently placed at the bottom of the family's unspoken hierarchy. And he keeps showing up. He keeps trying to be good at things. He keeps attempting connection with people who are often not especially interested in connecting with him. And occasionally, when the universe is not paying attention, he pulls off something that nobody expected. He survived an alien planet. He managed situations that smarter characters would have buckled under. He got Rick Sanchez kicked out of his own family, even if temporarily. Beth is the character whose damage is the most carefully calibrated. She is intelligent enough to know that she could have been more than she became, and she has organized her resentment about this very efficiently around the closest available target, which is usually Jerry. Her relationship with Rick is the wound that everything else in her life grows around. He abandoned her. She never stopped wanting his approval. And when he came back and installed himself in her garage and began disrupting her household, she welcomed him, because having him is better than the alternative, even when having him is actively making things worse. The show's Season 3 handling of Beth's clone situation, in which Rick offers her the chance to have a copy of herself maintain her ordinary life while the real Beth does something more interesting, is the most direct confrontation with what Beth wants and is afraid to want. The episode refuses to tell you definitively whether the Beth who continues through the rest of the season is the real Beth or the clone. And the show has maintained that ambiguity deliberately. This is not a loose end, it is a choice. The show is saying that the question of whether this Beth is real or copied is less important than the question of what she does now, which applies equally whether she is original or duplicate. Summer's arc across the series has been one of the most satisfying slow builds the show has accomplished. She begins as the background teenager, the one Rick did not pick, the one who matters less within the show's own internal logic as it was first presented. And she systematically refuses to accept that designation. She forces her way into adventures. She proves herself in situations that were not designed for her. She earns, through repeated demonstration rather than through anyone's charity, a place in the action that was not originally available to her. Her emotional core is the fear of being unnecessary, of being the child who was not planned, who might not have been chosen, who exists in a family where the most extraordinary person in the universe chose her younger brother over her. She manages this fear by performing certainty. By being definitively cool, definitively capable, definitively someone who does not need anyone's validation. The performance is so good that it reads as confidence. But underneath it is the same vulnerability that is underneath everything in this family. The worry that love is conditional, that it can be withdrawn. That being found insufficient is not a hypothetical but an imminent possibility. The Smiths are a family of people who love each other imperfectly and consistently and with a ferocity that the show is careful not to romanticize. They are not a happy family. They are a functional one, which is different, and possibly more honest about what family actually is for most people. The chaos that Rick introduces is not the cause of the family's dysfunction. It is a catalyst that reveals dysfunction that was always there and that the family has developed elaborate systems to manage. Section 15. The bottom of the iceberg. Things the show is still building toward. Here is the thing about a show that has been running since 2013 and that has, as of this writing, produced 9 seasons of television. The bottom of the iceberg is not fixed. The show is still adding to it. The things we have not yet understood, the questions that have been planted but not yet answered, represent a layer that the show is still actively constructing. Some of these open questions are cosmological. What is outside the Central Finite Curve, and what is evil Morty finding there? The show has introduced him into a portion of the multiverse where the familiar rules do not apply, which should theoretically allow for stories that operate on different assumptions than everything that has come before. But the direction of those stories has not fully revealed itself yet. What happened to Rick Prime? The show addressed his fate in Season 7, but the ripple effects of that confrontation on Rick C-137's psychology are still being worked through. A character who has spent decades organizing his existence around a revenge goal does not simply integrate the completion of that goal without significant cost. The question of who Rick is now that the hunt is over is one of the most interesting spaces the show has opened up. The status of the clone Beth question remains unresolved. Wherever Beth went, or whether she is the Beth who stayed, her experience of whatever she did or is doing is presumably influencing who she is in ways that the show will eventually have to address. The relationship between Morty's accumulated trauma and his ongoing development as a person is a thread that the show has never fully closed. He is getting older, in whatever modified sense applies given Rick's apparent manipulation of the family's aging. He has experienced things. He is changing. The question of who Morty becomes when the relationship with Rick eventually changes in the ways that all relationships eventually change is something the show seems to be slowly approaching. And then there is the thing that sits at the very bottom. The thing that the show has been circling for years without quite landing on it directly. What does Rick Sanchez want? Not what does he say he wants. Not what does he perform wanting. What, underneath all of it, at the level of his actual self rather than his constructed persona, does he want? The show has given us fragments. He wants Morty to be okay. He wants Birdperson back. He wanted Diane and could not get her back and decided to build a section of the multiverse rather than accept her absence. He wants to be free, whatever that means for someone who has access to infinite dimensions. He wants maybe to be less alone. He wants maybe to believe that being here means something even while actively arguing that nothing means anything. That is not a nihilist. That is a person in pain who has built a philosophy around the pain, because the philosophy is easier to carry than the grief, and the show has been patient in its approach to this. It has not tried to cure Rick. It has not manufactured a redemption arc that resolves everything cleanly. It has shown a character who is carrying something enormous and dealing with it imperfectly and continuing, in spite of everything, to show up for the people he refuses to admit he loves. That is, when you sit with it, one of the most genuinely honest portraits of a certain kind of person that animation has ever produced. Not a hero, not a villain, a person. Brilliant and damaged, and sometimes kind and sometimes terrible, and always, underneath everything, reaching for something he cannot quite name. That is the bottom of the iceberg. A man who cannot say what he needs, surrounded by people who cannot fully see him, in a universe so vast that the idea of any one person mattering should be laughable. And the show keeps making the case, episode after episode, that he matters anyway. That they all do. Not because the universe decided so, but because they chose to, and the choosing is the whole of it. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This took a long time to put together, and it means a lot that you stayed through it. If any of this gave you something to think about, or if there is a thread you think deserves its own deep dive, Drop it in the comments. This community is one of the best parts of doing this. Hit that like button if the video was worth your time, and subscribe if you want more of this. There are more icebergs where this one came from, and the water gets considerably colder the further down you go. See you in the next one. Section 16. The supporting characters the show almost never talks about. The main cast of Rick and Morty gets most of the analytical attention, and for good reason. They are layered and developed, and the show returns to them again and again in ways that reward close reading. But some of the most interesting work the show has done has been with characters who appear briefly, sometimes only once, and who carry enormous weight in that limited space. Krombopulos Michael is, for many fans, the clearest example of how the show can take a concept that should be purely comedic and make it quietly devastating in the same breath. He is an assassin, an enthusiastic, affable, genuinely pleasant assassin who loves his work with the kind of uncomplicated joy Noah's Toible reserved for hobbies they took up in retirement. When he buys a weapon from Rick in Morty Night Run, his delight is infectious in a deeply wrong way. He has no moral qualms about what he does. He does not experience the cognitive dissonance that most people use to navigate the ethical complexity of causing harm. He just likes killing. It makes him happy. And his happiness is somehow charming. The show then kills him almost immediately. Morty, trying to prevent Krombopulos Michael from completing an assassination, crashes a ship into him. He dies instantly, and largely by accident, as a consequence of Morty's good intentions producing catastrophic, unintended outcomes. The intended target, the creature Krombopulos Michael was going to kill, turns out to be so powerful and so dangerous that an entire planet has to be destroyed to neutralize it. All the lives lost in that planetary destruction are, the show quietly points out, a direct consequence of Morty saving one life by taking another. This is a tight, efficient piece of moral philosophy delivered through the death of a minor character who existed primarily to say the line, "Oh boy, here I go killing again," with the enthusiasm of someone who has found their calling. The show does not editorialize. It just presents the chain of cause and effect and leaves you to sit with it. Unity, the hive mind Rick once loved, gets more development than her episode count suggests because of how precisely the show uses her to illuminate something about Rick's psychology. Unity is literally everyone at once. She can be the partner who knows exactly what Rick needs because she is made of enough people that she can adapt to anything. She can be the friend who calls him out on his self-destruction because she is simultaneously emotionally invested and sufficiently diffuse that she cannot be hurt by his pushback the way an individual person would be. And she still chooses to leave. Her note to Rick is one of the most honest things anyone says to him across the entire run of the show. She tells him that she loves him, but that being around him makes her diminish. That his nihilism is contagious. That she chooses to leave not because she does not care, but because caring about herself requires distance from him. This is a characterization so precise and so familiar that it was probably painful for a lot of viewers to read. Rick's response to that note, the scene in the garage that we discussed earlier, is the scene that tells you more about Rick than almost anything else. He does not call her. He does not try to follow her. He does not process the rejection out loud. He sits with it in the only way he knows how, which is alone and in silence and with a machine he was about to point at himself. The show trusts you to understand what that means without spelling it out. Tammy Giederman is a character who manages to be genuinely surprising, even to viewers who thought they had the show figured out. She appears first as a high school friend of Summer's. She is the kind of character who, in a lesser show, would exist purely as set dressing for Summer's social life. She comes to parties, she has opinions about school, she is background color, and then she shows up at Birdperson's wedding as a federal agent of the Galactic Federation who has been undercover for years, and in one sentence, the entire texture of every scene she was in before that moment changes. All of Summer's high school scenes from the first season are now scenes that contain a federal agent. The ordinary social world of the Smith kids was being watched. The Federation was operating at a level of detail that included befriending a teenager to gather intelligence on an alien veteran and his interdimensional criminal scientist friend. This is the kind of revelation that makes you want to go back and watch every scene Tammy was in from the beginning with different eyes. And what you find, if you do, is that the show was careful. Tammy was not given characteristics that contradict what she is revealed to be. She was just not given characteristics that confirmed it either. She was written to be perfectly ordinary, which turns out to have been the most suspicious thing about her. Adolf Linkler, the half-Abraham Lincoln, half-Adolf Hitler genetic experiment that Rick created and then abandoned, is one of the show's most efficient pieces of dark comedy. He exists in a state of constant internal war between his two genetic sources. He wants to be good and simultaneously has impulses toward the worst expressions of human behavior, and neither side can win because he is built from contradictions that cancel each other out. His tragedy is that he was created this way on purpose, as an experiment, and then left to navigate an existence that was designed to be impossible. The show plays him mostly for laughs, and he is funny, the performance lands, the joke works. But underneath the comedy is a genuinely haunting concept. Rick created a person, built conflict into that person's fundamental nature, and then moved on to something else. Adolf Linkler was not a mistake that Rick is trying to fix. He was a project Rick got bored with. The suffering implied by his condition is incidental to the comedy, and the show knows it is incidental, and names that incidentalness by having Rick be utterly untroubled about it. This is the version of Rick that the show keeps showing you between the emotional moments. The one who creates things, who builds people in some cases, and who walks away when they are no longer interesting. Every character who exists in Rick's wake is dealing with some version of the same experience. He arrived, he changed something fundamental, and he left. The only question is what the thing he changed does with itself afterward. Section 17. The animation and what it is hiding. Rick and Morty looks deceptively simple. The character designs, especially in the early seasons, have a roughness to them that reads as sketch-like, as though the show was drawn quickly by someone who did not overthink the lines. Rick's proportions are exaggerated. Morty's features are soft and vague in a way that makes him feel deliberately generic. The backgrounds are functional rather than lush. This aesthetic is doing several things at once. It is a reference to the show's origins in Roiland's deliberately crude channel 101 Animations, where the roughness was the point. It is a contrast with the conceptual ambition of the stories, which deal with ideas that should require a more sophisticated visual vocabulary than the show appears to be using. And it is a deliberate trap, because when the animation breaks from its established looseness and commits to a moment of visual precision, the effect is disproportionate. The careful framing of the garage suicide attempt, the slowly pulling back camera in the Ricklantis mix-up reveal, the visual chaos of the Central Finite Curve breaking apart. These moments hit harder because of the contrast with everything around them. The rough aesthetic makes the precise moments feel like the show is suddenly paying full attention, which makes you pay full attention in response. The color language in the show is also more deliberate than it initially appears. Rick's blue skin tones, his gray hair, the laboratory greens and blues that dominate his workspace create a palette that reads as cold. The warm oranges and reds associated with the Smith house exterior and the family's more domestic scenes create a thermal contrast. You are visually cued about what kind of scene you are in before anyone says a word. The portal gun's green vortex is one of the most recognizable visual elements in recent animation, and the choice of that specific shade of green was not accidental. It is the same shade, or close to it, as the green screen used in filmmaking. This is either a visual pun about the way that portals open on possibilities the way a green screen opens on any backdrop, or it is a coincidence, or it is both, which is the kind of answer that is most consistent with how Rick and Morty works. The alien creature design throughout the show draws on a tradition of inventive science fiction design, while also having a distinct visual language of its own. Many of the aliens look like someone took familiar animal features and recombined them in ways that should not work but somehow do. Birdperson looks like exactly what his name suggests, and somehow the simplicity of his design communicates dignity rather than absurdity. The Meeseek's electric blue coloring and fixed grin are designed to signal cheerfulness in a way that becomes deeply unsettling when the context turns dark. Rick and Morty has also used animation to do things that live-action television simply cannot do with comparable efficiency. The episode that splits the screen into multiple simultaneous realities in a wrinkle in time would require prohibitive technical resources in live action. The Cronenberg transformation sequences require a fluidity of biological horror that even the best practical effects would struggle to achieve. The show is fully aware that it is an animated show, and it uses the specific capabilities of that medium rather than trying to replicate what live action does. The visual continuity the show maintains between episodes is more rigorous than the rough aesthetic suggests it should be. Background items in Rick's garage are consistent. The layout of the Smith house follows a floor plan that is internally coherent. When the show wants to signal that something has changed fundamentally about a familiar space, it does so through small environmental modifications that reward careful viewers. Section 18. The music and why Ryan Elder is more important than people know. The score of Rick and Morty is one of the most underappreciated elements of the show's success, and Ryan Elder's work deserves considerably more attention than it typically receives in discussions of what makes the show work. The main title theme is recognizable to essentially anyone who has spent time with the show. Its synthesized, slightly melancholy, driving quality establishes the tone of the show in about 30 seconds. It is adventurous and slightly anxious. It moves quickly and does not quite resolve in the way that traditional adventure theme music resolves. It ends on a note that suggests forward motion rather than arrival. Elder studied the emotional requirements of each scene and composed music that supports the intended feeling without over-explaining it. This is harder than it sounds. Bad television scoring tells you how to feel about a scene by being excessively on the nose about it. Good scoring creates space for the scene to breathe, while filling that space with something that makes the breathing feel right. Elder's work consistently does the latter. The low strings that accompany Rick's more genuinely vulnerable moments, the synthesizer swell that appears in the interdimensional sequences, suggesting scale without using the massive orchestral language that usually signals scale in film and television. The deliberately wrong-feeling musical choices in the comedy sequences, where the score plays something that sits slightly askew from what you would expect, creating a gentle musical uncanny valley that mirrors the show's thematic interest in things being just slightly off from what they appear. For the damaged coda by Blonde Redhead, used in the evil Morty reveal at the end of the Rick Lantis mix-up, is the most discussed musical choice the show has made, and the discussion is warranted. The song's tone, the way it builds, the specific quality of its electronic elements, lands in the exact emotional space between beauty and dread that the scene requires. It is the sound of something being recognized that you did not know you had been looking for. Evil Morty removing the eye patch and being revealed as president is a plot development. The music is what makes it feel like a prophecy being fulfilled. The show has also used licensed music in ways that go beyond the conventional television use of popular songs as emotional shorthand. The musical choices in Rick and Morty are often surprising in ways that are immediately right. 9 Inch Nails in the Unity episode. The use of the song in the post-credits of the Season 1 finale. These are not choices made to make the soundtrack playlist commercially appealing. They are choices made because the specific emotional register of those specific songs matched the specific emotional register of the scenes they were placed in. Section 19. The show's relationship with its own fandom. Rick and Morty has had one of the more complicated relationships with its own audience of any show in recent television history. The show's early fandom was intensely devoted in the way that cult comedy audiences tend to be, forming communities, developing elaborate theories, and treating the show's internal logic as a text worthy of the kind of close reading usually reserved for canonical literature. This devotion was, on the whole, productive. It kept the show in conversation between seasons. It generated the kind of sustained attention that helped the show build to cultural moment status by the time Season 3 began airing in 2017. The delay between Season 2 and Season 3 was over a year, and the fandom's patience during that delay was maintained largely by the activity of those communities, picking over every available detail. But the fandom also developed a subset that the show, and Harmon in particular, found troubling. The segment of viewers who had latched onto Rick as an aspirational figure, as a model for how to live and how to relate to other people. Rick's contempt for social convention, his dismissal of the emotional needs of others, his insistence on his own superiority, were being adopted as behavioral templates. And this was being done, frequently, by people who had missed the show's persistent, consistent critique of all of those behaviors. Dan Harmon addressed this in various interviews with varying degrees of patience. His essential point, stated in different ways at different times, was that Rick Sanchez is not a role model. The show is not saying that Rick's way of moving through the world is correct. It is saying that Rick's way of moving through the world has produced a person who is profoundly alone, who has destroyed or damaged virtually every relationship he has ever had, and who sustains himself through intelligence that also prevents him from confronting the things that actually need to change. The Szechuan sauce incident in 2017 crystallized this tension. McDonald's brought back the sauce as a promotional tie-in with the show. They offered it at specific locations for a limited time. The quantities were wildly insufficient for the demand, and videos emerged of customers screaming at fast food workers, of people in genuine distress over the absence of a promotional sauce, of what appeared to be small-scale consumer riots. This was, in an ironic way, the show's themes playing out in real life. A show about the arbitrary nature of desire, about the absurdity of organizing your existence around things that do not matter cosmically, had created a situation in which its fans were destroying themselves over a piece of promotional material tied to a bit in an animated series. The show's own conclusion about this, stated through Rick in subsequent episodes, was a kind of exhausted acknowledgement that the universe is too large to be upset about and too small, apparently, for some people to keep perspective in. The fandom's relationship with the show has matured somewhat since that peak moment. The post-Roiland era drew a lot of the more parasocial identity investment fans away, and what remains is a community that is more interested in the actual texture of the show than in whatever cultural status attaches to watching it. This is probably healthier for everyone involved. The show has also been an active conversation with its fan theories in ways that are occasionally openly hostile to them. The show has, on multiple occasions, introduced a fan theory as a plot point only to demolish it. It has characters reference common interpretations of the show's events and then clarify or contradict them. This meta-relationship with its own reception is very Rick and Morty. The show enjoys pulling the floor out from under comfortable certainties, including comfortable certainties about what the show itself means. Section 20. The legacy and where it sits in television history. Rick and Morty will be studied, when people study the television of this era, as a show that did something genuinely new. Not in terms of the ideas it engaged with, many of which have a long history in science fiction literature and philosophy, but in terms of how it packaged those ideas for a broad animated comedy audience, and in terms of the specific balance it struck between emotional depth and deliberate irreverence. The show proved, in a way that had not quite been proven before it arrived, that an animated comedy could carry genuine narrative weight across multiple seasons without sacrificing the comedic identity that made it popular in the first place. This seems obvious in retrospect because there are now more shows attempting versions of this balance. But Rick and Morty was doing it before the template was established. It also demonstrated that an audience that might not typically seek out philosophy or existentialism would engage with those ideas if they were wrapped in accessible, funny, emotionally resonant packaging. The show did not talk down to its audience. It did not simplify the ideas until they became something other than what they were. It presented genuinely difficult material and trusted that the people watching were capable of engaging with it, and it was correct. The influence of the show on subsequent animation is visible in how many series since 2013 have attempted the tonal balance that Rick and Morty developed. Not many of them have succeeded at it to the same degree. The balance is harder to achieve than watching the finished product suggests. It requires writing that is funny enough to sustain the comedy identity while also being honest enough to produce genuine emotion. Those two things are in tension. The comedy instinct wants to break the tension with a joke. The emotional instinct wants to hold the tension until it resolves properly. Most shows err too far in one direction. Rick and Morty walks the line more consistently than almost anything else in its genre. The show is also significant as a piece of popular art that engaged, at a level of genuine seriousness, with questions about identity, consciousness, and the ethics of intelligence that most mainstream entertainment treats as too abstract for mass audiences. The multiverse is not just a plot device in Rick and Morty. It is a philosophical thought experiment that the show uses to ask what it means to make choices when every choice is being made somewhere. Memory is not just a story mechanism. It is a meditation on the relationship between experience and identity and what you lose when pieces of your past are removed. These are questions that philosophy has been grappling with formally for centuries. Rick and Morty found a way to bring them to Saturday night animation audiences in a form that did not require any prior knowledge of the formal tradition. That is a remarkable thing to have done. Where the show goes from here, with its ongoing seasons and its slowly evolving cast and its unresolved threads, is something that depends on choices that have not been made yet. The iceberg below the current waterline is still being built. The sections of it that we have access to now are extensive and complex and reward close attention, but the deeper sections remain dark. And in the Rick and Morty tradition, that darkness is probably where the most interesting things are hiding. If you made it this far, you are officially someone who thinks too hard about a cartoon show. I mean that as the highest possible compliment. Leave a like if this was worth your evening. Subscribe so you are here for the next one. And drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is. I want to know where in the world people go to think about Rick and Morty at this hour. Until next time. Section 21. The episodes that changed everything. There are certain episodes of Rick and Morty that function as before and after markers. The show has a shape before them and a different shape after them. They are not always the most comedically successful episodes or the most quotable or the ones that showed up most in memes. But they are the ones where the show made decisions that altered the fundamental nature of what it was attempting. Rick Potion number 9 from Season 1 is the first of these. In the history of Rick and Morty, this episode represents the moment when the show decided not to be what most animated comedies are. Most animated comedies exist in a permanent present. Homer Simpson has been the same age doing the same job in the same house for over 3 decades. Nothing that happens in one episode has permanent consequences for the next. The world resets. This is not a flaw in those shows. It is a genre convention that allows them to do what they do. Rick Potion number 9 is the episode where Rick and Morty explicitly announced that it was going to be a different kind of show. Rick's love potion spreads through a flu virus and becomes a biological cascade that transforms the human population of Earth. Rick cannot fix it. He makes it worse. And instead of undoing it with some convenient science, he solves the problem by leaving, by finding a parallel dimension where the problem was already solved, where the versions of themselves who solved it have just died, and by installing himself and Morty into those lives. The original Smith family, the Jerry and Beth and Summer who knew Rick and Morty from day one, are still in a Cronenberged world. They adapted, they survived, they became something different. And Rick and Morty moved on. They buried themselves. They live in someone else's house. This was the show saying, clearly and without qualification, that consequences are permanent, that the people in this story cannot rely on a reset button, and that some things once broken cannot be put back the way they were. You adapt, or you leave, and either way you are carrying what happened with you. The Vat of Acid episode from Season 4 is the one that most efficiently demolishes a specific type of wish. It is an episode that tells you with meticulous narrative precision that the ability to undo your choices is not a gift. It is a trap. Morty acquires a device that lets him restart from checkpoints, essentially giving him save states for his own life. He uses it to make choices he would otherwise be afraid to make. He takes risks. He lets things fall apart knowing he can reload. And then the show takes everything he built using that freedom and reveals that it was real all along. The relationship he formed, the experiences that felt genuinely earned because he chose them without the ability to undo them, were not rehearsals. They were real. And his ability to restart from save states meant that the person he had become during that time was someone who had genuinely lived, while simultaneously being someone who did not know how to value what he had because he thought he could always get it back. The device does not give you the ability to undo your choices. It gives you the ability to have a life in which your choices do not cost anything. And the show argues, precisely, that a life in which choices do not cost anything is not a life at all. It is a simulation. And the real version of yourself, the one with consequences attached to its decisions, is the version that actually matters. Rick's Minutes from Season 1 is the episode most people cite as the moment they realize the show was something different. It takes the concept of interdimensional cable, which is pure comedic premise with no emotional obligations, and uses it to run a completely different story in parallel. While Rick and Morty watch random alien television, the family discovers alternate dimension versions of themselves in which various members chose differently. Beth and Jerry, in particular, discover the lives they might have had if they had not gotten pregnant and married young. The alternate Jerry is a famous actor. The alternate Beth is a celebrated surgeon who achieved everything her intelligence and ambition pointed toward. They are both happy. And watching those versions of themselves, the actual Beth and Jerry are confronted with the full weight of what they gave up for each other and whether what they got in return was worth it. The show does not sentimentalize this. It lets Beth and Jerry sit with genuine grief about the roads not taken, and then it does something that is simultaneously comforting and kind of devastating. It shows them the alternate versions who chose differently. And some of those versions are doing wonderfully, and some of them are alone. And some of them made different choices that led to different regrets. The multiverse, which the show usually uses for comedy and adventure, Here becomes a meditation on the way every life is the accumulation of roads you did not take as much as it is the road you did. Summer's emotional crisis in this episode, her discovering the documentation of her parents' uncertainty about keeping her, is handled with genuine delicacy. Morty's response to her, the speech that has become the most quoted piece of dialogue in the show, comes from a character who has already seen enough of the multiverse to understand that the arbitrary nature of existence does not make any given existence less real or less worth protecting. Nobody exists on purpose. And yet here they are, together, on a couch, in a house that is exactly theirs, in a life that was not planned but is happening anyway. That is not nihilism. That is something more honest and more gentle than nihilism, and it is one of the most beautiful things the show has ever done with its freedom. The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 is the episode that functioned as both a genuine emotional gut punch and a structural reset that made the entire arc of Season 3 possible. Birdperson's wedding, Tammy's betrayal, the Federation raid, Rick choosing to surrender himself to protect his family, the post-credits scene of the Smith family without Rick, adjusting, managing, discovering that life without Rick is less dramatic but also less dangerous. These are all pieces of the episode doing different kinds of work. Rick surrendering is the most important piece, because Rick Sanchez, the man who treats the universe as his personal laboratory and maintains that he answers to no authority, choosing to give himself up is a moment that crystallizes everything the show has been building toward. He does it for Beth and Jerry and Summer and Morty. He does not say this. He does not explain himself. He is in handcuffs and then he is gone and the family stands there and the audience understands something that none of them do. He is capable of sacrifice. He has always been capable of it. The armor he wears, the performance of not caring, of being above the stakes that everyone else is trapped in, is armor because something underneath it is worth protecting. And the thing worth protecting is not Rick's comfort or Rick's freedom or Rick's sense of his own exceptional status. It is them, the people in the house. The ordinary, imperfect, sometimes frustrating humans who are his family. He surrenders himself to a prison cell in a space station so that they can stay safe in their suburb. And then the show lets him be in that prison cell for exactly as long as it needs to before he breaks out with the casual efficiency of someone who was always going to break out and was really just taking the scenic route. But the image of him in that cell, before the escape, is the image the show wanted you to hold. The smartest being in the universe, choosing confinement for love he will never acknowledge out loud. These are the episodes that live at the waterline of the iceberg. Not quite at the surface where everyone can see them, not quite below where they require excavation. They are visible if you look at the right angle, in the right light, with the right kind of patience. And they tell you if you are willing to hear it, everything the show is actually saying underneath all the noise.